Welcome to a radical discussion of independence, free will, liberty, and the left-hand path. This is Damonosophy with your host, Paul Frederick.
Welcome, friends and fellow Damons, to another episode of Damonosophy. Tonight, Dr. Stephen Flowers returns to the show to discuss his latest work from Inner Traditions, Magian Tarok, the origins of the Tarot in the Mithraic and Hermetic traditions. Dr. Flowers, welcome to the show again.
Well, I'm glad to be back. Glad to have made it through to see you again, or hear you again.
Yes, likewise.
Uh-huh.
So, tell us about the book. How did you discover the information that is the basis for your research in this book?
Well, I was studying runology, of course, at the university, and a figure, a very interesting individual, a Swedish scholar by the name of Sigurd Agrell, had developed in the 1920s and 30s a theory about the runes, which is called the Usart theory, that the runes actually began with the U rune rather than the F rune, which is a thoroughly discredited idea among runologists. But he wrote a lot of voluminous material about various things. And so he did do a lot of homework and background and so forth. And one of his specialties, one of the things he looked into, was the idea of numerology, gematria, if you will, and in connection with Greek letters, and then the runes and the influence of them, and the whole Mithraic cult, which he saw as formative in the runic tradition. And so I, of course, investigated his works and so forth, and came across in Germany, actually, when I was doing research there, a book by him which was about the Tarot. It was in German, and about the Tarot and the runes and Mithraism and that sort of thing. And so I got a copy of that book and I read it and researched in it and so forth. And so that was the beginning of it. But I saw, well, some of his theories are wrong, but some of his theories are spot on or very interesting. And he was a very learned person, and he's written a lot of things on a lot of interesting subjects. And so that's where it started. And then my interest in Persian, Iranian spirituality and things of that nature dovetailed in here. And I wrote about 2005 a first edition of this book, and then subsequently I learned much more about Iranian traditions and history and religion. And so this book, this edition, is definitely much more, it's expanded and much more accurate in its depiction of Iranian background information and such things like that. So one of the things about Mithraism is this widely thought by many scholars. Originally it was thought to be, well, this is Persian religion in the Roman Empire. Like Franz Cumont and people like that believe that sort of thing. And then there was a backlash against that, the way scholarship works in a bad way. It's like, oh, we're going to disprove that. So this is just a Roman invention, completely Roman thing. It has nothing to do with Persian ideas at all. It's just, showmanship or something, pretending to be that. But then, and besides that, we'd have no idea about this Mithra, cult of Mithra and things like that in Iran. But as we subsequently Iranian studies got more detailed and more knowledgeable, there was a whole treasure trove of things found at Persepolis that showed this martial Mithraic cult that was active in Iran and among the Persians, Iranians, and so forth, and of course their client peoples everywhere throughout their empire. And this is what was imported and, of course, transformed, as Roman people always do. They always took everything they got a hold of and Romanized it and created their own version of it, and that's what happened. But it does have a lot of interesting things to recommend itself as far as the whole Mediterranean Mithraic idea of sort of synthesizing ideas from all kinds of places in the world throughout the Roman Empire and sort of funneling them together. What's fascinating about the Mithraic cult is it's kind of like a proto-Freemasonry, and I don't mean just the rituals that are used, but rather also the purpose behind it. And that is one of the main purposes, a social purpose, which was that within the order, all men, and it was mostly all men who were members, not exclusively as formerly thought, but almost exclusively, all the men were ranked according to their initiatory grades, not according to their mundane levels of socioeconomic status. So that a slave, there were slaves who were, of course, half the people in the empire were slaves. There were slaves who were masters of these Mithraea. They were the highest initiate in the group. And so an emperor or a patrician guard or whatever might come into the order and be inferior to, and put in an inferior position and have to go through that process to a slave. And so it was this idea that all men are brothers in the order, and they're all ranked according to their initiatory grade within the order without respect to their socioeconomic status outside the order. So that was very impactful in cementing relationships and making a socioeconomic kind of new fabric and revolutionary new thing within the empire. Of course, the Christians completely destroyed the order and killed everyone, and then just covered up the temples and that sort of thing. Which has been one of the good things about that process was that since they buried the temples, they were left unmolested, and now archaeologists have dug them all up, and they're there to be discovered. One of them was discovered in London after the Blitz. It was underground there, and people didn't even know it was there. But
so would you say Mithraism then? Would you say it's sort of a bridge between the more ancient Iranian Persian mythological symbolism? Is a bridge between that and the modern Tarot?
Yeah, definitely. Well, into the ancient world, and into, of course, the world of the Tarot, which is what we're sort of the book's about. Experts and scholars and historians of the Tarot will tell you that there's no indication that the Tarot existed before the mid-1400s, thereabouts, at the earliest. So it's the Italian Renaissance creation, so one might say. But then you start to dig a little bit deeper and say, well, where did this system come from? It's obviously not an invention based on known or easily discoverable ideas within Neoplatonism or something like that, so that it's been mysterious that way. But if you say, well, where one of the peoples that were, so these people have something to do with the Tarot, and that's those darn gypsies. Now, that's a word that is, of course, it's a pejorative term, and people don't like to use that word in relation to the people, the Romani people, that are referred to with that word gypsy. Now, where did that word gypsy come from? It means Egyptian, right? And why was that? Well, they saw these kind of darker-skinned people and who were involved with, well, music, magic. They were nomadic people wandering about the countryside, very weird people. So the Christian people thought. And so they just said, well, they're gypsies. Well, like from everything these people knew about history or ethnography had to be drawn from the Bible, because that was about all anybody knew anything about, including educated people. Mm-hmm. And so there were certain evil countries, of course, evil lands from the Old Testament, those being places like Egypt, like Babylon, like Canaan, and so forth. And so these are people, they're involved with magic, like when Moses had the magical duel with Pharaoh and his priests and all that. And so they're magicians. So they're connected to the Tarot, this weird system of cards and things that they might have used for divination or other things. Now, who were the Romani people really? Well, they are a people from northern India at the border of Iran or Persia and India, up in the Punjab region there. And they spoke, when they spoke their own language, that's a language that's just related to Hindi. It's an Indo-European language from the Indian subcontinent. And there's a story in the Shahnameh, the Persian epic poem of the kings of Persia that was written in the 1200s by Firdausi, the great Persian poet. Now, he tells a story in there about a Shah, an emperor of Iran, who had heard about these people in India who were musicians and entertainers, and they were skilled at that. And he said, well, the people of Iran and my empire, the poor people do not have access, like we in the court, to music and to entertainment. So I am going to bring these people into the empire and give them an ox and seed to plant so they can farm and do agricultural work with the stipulation that they provide entertainment to the poor of the empire, of the Persian Empire. But then these people, according to the story, ate their ox and just squandered the seed and didn't plant anything and did all sorts of mischief and terrible things. And so he drove them out of the empire and they sent them west, into Rome, into the Roman territory. And that's how they transitioned. Now, but they spent a lot of time in Iran. They were already sort of this kind of Hindi kind of culture, and so. But this is who these people actually are. And so then we're going to look for if there's any connection to a more Eastern set of symbols and things like that that might be connected with the Tarot, with these symbols, the sort of a series of symbols. And so actually, Zurvanism didn't know anything about that story, I don't think, and didn't say anything about it. But so there's a lot of things in there that I've discovered on my own, but where you see this thing making the connection, or he made these connections with Rome, with the Roman system, Latinate system of writing and that sort of thing, is that this idea, at the time of the Mithraism, there was, they used Greek or Latin and in their inscriptions and things like that. So the Roman alphabet used 22 letters for divinatory purposes. The Latin alphabet in classical times had 23 letters total, but the epsilon, the Y character, was never used, could not be used initially as an initial letter, and was only used in Greek borrowings anyway. So it was out. So there were only 22 letters for divinatory, oracular purposes in the Roman system. And so he took and he said, well, what about these letters? And put them in order, and then look at certain key words that may match up with the Tarot symbols, like, for example, the A letter, the first one, he connects with the Egyptian, the most famous bull in, and of course there's that kind of runic thing, this bovine. It's the most famous bull in the world. It's the Apis bull in Egypt, right? So A, Apis, that sort of thing. So he goes down the row, and it's amazing how these things match up with Latin words that go A, B, C, down the line, that match up with the Tarot order. Not only do they correspond, but they also correspond in order. And that is the key. I mean, you see a lot of speculation of all kinds in esoteric books or magic books or occult or New Age books, wherein people make correspondences between things, but almost always they lack any kind of systematic association. They're just random, one-to-one, one here, one there, and that seems similar to that, and so forth. But in the ancient world, and something that's authentic and created from traditional ancient world, the key will always be it not only corresponds, but corresponds in some kind of pre-established order. And so he showed that seems to be the case here, that these symbols match up to keywords that are answer to the Tarot and to the Latin alphabet. But he says also that probably the original association was with the Greek alphabet, and that it was 24 symbols and not 22. The reduction to 22 was an adaptation by the Romans of an originally Greek system. And there he makes the connection also with the runes and that sort of thing. And it's kind of remarkable how also, if you do his system, and take the F out of the first rune and start with the bovine, the Uruz rune, and then go through the same system, how well these also seem to match up. So it's kind of interesting that way. And it may be that what's happened there is that there's a medieval or ancient way of encoding systems, but it's just a substitution code where you take, they say, well, let's make B, the letter B, we're going to write that for A, and C for B, and so forth. Just shift them one, and that's the code, right? And so that's may have been the case that the Uthark idea that he had was just an encoding. And what he noticed when he did this is that when he assigned the new numerical values to the runes, then they came up with the gematria worked out so that they seemed to answer to Mediterranean ideas of symbolic numbers more than they did if he didn't do that. But, that's all speculation, as is the whole thing. And what it is what's fascinating about the book is for people who are really into the Tarot to say, here is something new. It's not just there are 200 Tarot decks out there. There are how many hundreds of books on the subject, but most of them are telling the same or similar stories, depending on whether it's a Thelemite or a Golden Dawn or whatever, but it's all basically the same stuff over and over again. And also it's pretty much rooted in oftentimes a complete modern interpretation, which attaches these 22 symbols to the Hebrew alphabet, which we know when that happened with Eliphas Levi in the early part of the 19th century. We know that didn't happen, and that there's nothing Kabbalistic or the Judaic tradition has no clue or interest in that, and all of that sort of thing. And it has nothing to do with Egypt. It has nothing to do with the Kabbalah until 200 years ago. So if it does, if anything we're looking at for some kind of genuine, archaic, ancient, authentic connection, we have to make a nexus in the Roman world, in the Italian Renaissance world, etc., to make these kinds of connections. And Sigurd Agrell did a lot of work there, and that's what this book is about. And it gets also into lining up or looking at the Iranian Zatas, the angels or gods and goddesses of the Zoroastrian calendar and system, and how those might have been behind the Tarot ultimately. And so what I hope that a true Tarot enthusiast will find things in this little book, that are meaningful, eye-opening, and new avenues of exploration. So what Agrell did for me, opening a door, and I hope this book will do for people who are enthusiastic about the Tarot but want to get into it on a more deep down level of archaic roots, the archetypes, the ultimate archetypes of these symbols. And, of course, it liberates it also from the, Judeo-Christian mythology. Right.
And so who are the Magians in Magian Tarok?
Well, they are the priests of the Zoroastrian world or of the Iranian world. Even what we would call Mithraism is perhaps more orthodox in its origins. That's what the Mithraic cult that found, the evidence found in Persepolis shows that it was not perhaps what people thought, that the Mithraism was a kind of a diva worship as far as the Iranians are concerned. And we know that the old religion, the pre-Zoroastrian religion, continued on among the Iranians, and the Orthodox Zoroastrians would call them, well, those are diva worshippers, they're devil worshippers, and that Mithra would be one of these. Mithra is completely Zoroastrianized, and so this is a very positive, good entity. But he's killing a bull, right? That's what the picture of the Tauroctony, and that's where Agrell points out. Says, well, this image that's the centerpiece of all Mithraea, of all temples of Mithras, shows this figure, this Persian guy. He's wearing the Phrygian cap, this thing that identifies him as a Persian. He is killing a bull, with a knife. And they said, well, that's not very Zoroastrian. This idea of animal sacrifice is something they don't see as something that's very positive. So he must be some kind of, unorthodox figure. But of course, you look at the actual Zoroastrian sacred texts and so forth, and there are references to this, but it's not intended to be actual literal things, but rather symbolic occurrences of that are not intended to be literal, but there's not actually a bull being killed or anything like that. And of course, I think it's David Ulzani, I think it is, has pronounced, but he wrote the Origins of Mithraism, a book on that, and he points out these, we'll call them astrological symbolism, but it's astral symbolism, where Orion is seen, or the relationship between Orion and the constellation of Taurus and the pole star shift and all this sort of thing. That this we know, when you say, well, why did they start to count the years from 2,000 years ago? Why did they start? We call it before and after Christ. But the Romans actually shifted that and made a new calendar at that time, and they weren't doing it for Christian reasons. It was like something astrological or astral happened, and they were encouraging this idea that there was a renewal of the world at approximately that time, and Christianity just kind of hopped on that thing. So, yeah, that's us, that's Christ, that's what's happening, but they had already done that in pagan times. So, and these Mithrists were promoting that idea that the world is coming into a new age, is coming into a new way of being. And that was what they were trying to do in a practical, political, social way, right? That's what the order was trying to really not only just sit around and chant and wait for something to happen passively, but rather we're actually taking measures to make these sorts of things happen, which again to me, is again a very Persian, Iranian kind of thing. You're not just waiting for something to happen to you, but rather your will and your ability to do things is paramount, to do things right, to do things good. And so that is that. And then also, what are we doing with each individual here who comes into the Mithraic brotherhood? And that is, we're going to transform each individual, also renew them according to this initiatory astral, the ascension through the planets and the spheres of the planets spiritually, to transform the individual, but also to transform the world. And so you can see why Christianity was very threatened by this, because these people were actually doing stuff, right? And the way the whole Judeo-Christian way of thinking is, sit, be good, obey, and wait for God to act. Right? This isn't just Christianity, but Judaism also. That's why Orthodox Jews, oppose the establishment of the state of Israel, because that's human, that's people acting and making this happen. We want God to act and give us back the land by God's hand, So this is like wrong, what's happening. So, but that's not the Persian way, if you will. So
that's interesting. So why do you think, because you always hear with Mithraism that it was like largely soldiers, it was like largely Roman soldiers. So why do you think that it's said that is the case? Is that because the soldiers at the time were more interested in this, or they had more bandwidth for it, or?
I think that's a little bit wrong. I mean, in the sense that there were a lot of soldiers in the Roman Empire, right? I mean, it was a militaristic society. So of course there's going to be a lot of the men are going to be involved in that. But we know from the dedication, we know that the Mithras were very much like your Baptist church people, who make a bench, right? So this bench was donated by, George and Martha McGillicuddy, right? That kind of stuff on the back of the bench. Well, they have inscriptions in these things that tell about. And that's where we know about slaves and how slaves could earn money and were not as bad off as slaves are when we think about the American South and that sort of thing. So the slaves could have money and be intelligent. And of course, a lot of them were tutors in Greek and all kinds of things. And but there would be inscriptions that say this facade or this part of the temple or this whole temple was sponsored by so-and-so, and they give his profession and all that kind of thing. So we know a lot about the sociology of these groups and these inscriptions that are there. And so we see that they were tradesmen, trade people, craftsmen, soldiers, slaves, some of them, and all kinds of different professions, really. And a lot of them were foreigners. That's where the whole, and there's a lot of scholarship about Mithraism and Mithra and Odin and all this sort of thing, of some kind of influence. There's one of the Mithraea along the Rhine has an image of Mithra, not killing the bull in the normal way, but rather riding after it on horseback with a spear, like it's Odin here. So that then they said, well, this is where a lot of Germanic people, of course, they joined the Roman army in droves. That's the Roman army became largely Germanized. Half of the guys in it were Germans by the 3rd, 4th century, and then when in the 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Valerian invaded Iran, Persia, and was defeated by Shapur, and the whole army was either killed or taken captive, right, by the whole Roman army, including the emperor, and taken into Iran. And they disappeared. I said, "Whoa, what happened?" They tell horrible stories about, what the Persians did to them. Oh, they did terrible tortures, and that didn't happen because we have carved in stone lists of where the Iranian inscriptions that Naqsh Rustam would tell about who these people were, who the Romans were, where they were from, and they were like Germans and this, that, and the other. And they were taken to a couple of cities there in Mesopotamia, and the Romans were put to work as civil engineering projects, and some of those still stand today. They're Roman architecture. There's one called the Kaiser Bridge, the Caesar Bridge. It was built by this guy, or people, because all Roman soldiers were also civil engineers, right? They could move their army from place to place, build a fort practically overnight, and bridges and this, that, and the other. That was all part of that's where we get the admiration of that. Is responsible for the idea of the Army Corps of Engineers and that sort of thing. So that's what actually happened to him. And the Emperor Valerian lived 10 more years there with his men. And they were like they were prisoners. They couldn't leave, but at the same time they were not mistreated. That was the only thing that that's a kind of a Persian thing, that prisoners of war and things like that, if they're honorable people, are considered to be guests. You're just involuntary guest of me. And so they even in the hostage crisis in 1979, they referred to the Americans that they held captive, as their guests. So
no, that's really interesting because you mentioned the Shah earlier, and that reminded me. I don't know if you noticed it today. It was trending on Twitter. Former President Jimmy Carter was trending about going through brain surgery today, and that makes me, as being a Generation X guy, that makes me think of the Shah. So it's interesting that you bring that up. So can you talk a little bit about like the Shah, the modern Shah in 1979, and all the connections that tie in with that?
Well, the Shah of Iran was, a person who was not necessarily a very nice guy, we'll put it that way. But if we look at those times, 1979, the late 70s, etc., and see what this man was opposing, what he was trying to do, he was trying to bring Iran into the modern world. Many people think that he is on the verge. I think some of his grandchildren have converted to Zoroastrianism. And there's a book called In Search of Zarathustra. I can't remember the author's name. But he mentions in there that when they had this big celebration of the 2,000 or 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy in 1971, I think it was. I remember that because I was in Germany at the time, and there was going to the foreign language school, which had like people from 80 different countries, and one of the people that was there was a person who worked for the Ministry of Propaganda or whatever for the Shah. And he was a super enthusiast about the whole thing. And we saw newsreels at the movie theater. They still kind of had things like that in Germany at the time. Where it showed all this pageantry, and this guy was just going ape shit. He was so enthused about it. And so forth. And that's where some of the stuff that I've originally heard about, Zoroastrianism and the ancient way, and is from this guy. And this person in Search of Zarathustra said when the Shah went up in a ceremonial and a ritual, went up to the tomb of Cyrus the Great and did some speech or some talk, that half the people there, the Iranians, thought this guy is going to convert to Zoroastrianism right there. That's what it was widely thought, that was what was going to happen. But, that didn't happen. But because that would have just precipitated an even more rapid, because that's what these mullahs hated him for and were suspicious of him, and that's what really fueled them like mad. You can imagine a world in the Bible Belt, if you had some guy, a president or a governor or something like that, who was like on the verge of converting to Odinism or something, I mean, how that would engender hatred and opposition to this person. And so they're like fanatics, out of their mind fanatics anyway, these Muslims. And so, but that's what he was opposed. These were the people he saw as keeping Iran both backward and, not coming up, to the modern world when, he would see Iran was the great power and the great intellectual and spiritual center of the universe in ancient times, and now it's just an Islamic backwater, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, I want to, as nationalism on the one hand, but also modernism on the other. And he was opposed by these fanatics, and he was rough on them, as we have come to learn. As our own politicians have repeatedly told us after 9/11, these people only understand strength.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot argue with them. You can only kill them. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's our own people say that now, right? Mm-hmm. And he just knew that already from being one of them, being in their midst, being intimately involved with these people, yeah, you got to be tough on them. You know, I mean, they do not understand reason or anything. And so he was, yes, I remember at the time, you know, they would say, well, maybe the Shah, he may have 5,000, imagine that, 5,000 political prisoners in his dungeons or prisons or whatever. So we got to, you know, and that's why Jimmy Carter, I have no sympathy or no love for Jimmy Carter. He is what I call the focus of all evil in the late 20th century, because he was weak, okay? We had a guy there, the Shah of Iran, who was a friend of Israel, an ally of Israel, and an ally and friend, obviously, of the United States and the West and of the modern world. And, you know, and so the world would be so much different today. And we knew the Shah was dying. He already had cancer. He was dead within a year or something of abdicating. We knew that.
Yeah.
And his son would have been brought in, at least a constitutional monarchy or something like that. So it's kind of weird and, kind of suspicious as to the whole turn of events there. But certainly what I chalk it all up to is the naivete of a weak man, of a weak president who didn't stand by his friend, didn't stand by the global or the kind of realpolitik of that. So you're going to throw away a friend because he seems like a rough customer or a bad dude, you know, and doesn't seem like a nice guy. Is that why you're going to do this? You have no other reason to pull the rug out from under him. So you lost everything, and engendered, before 1979, there was no worldwide, jihadism and that kind of thing. These people started funding that stuff. So everything got bad. Everything got much worse. Or it was a new thing, new problem in the world that has been, Machiavelli pointed out, so we have these leaders, like, they can be bad people, bad individuals, they can be rough, they can be crass, they can be cruel, but if they're working for you rather than against you, then you want them. It's better to be feared than loved. It's working for the people, for your people, not against them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, it's like I can only imagine that the whole situation there is that, that whole thing opened up, and I was like 10 years old at the time, and we're hearing about all this stuff, they're force feeding, they're giving us propaganda about the Shah of Iran, and I remember it was like not even clear to me back then if he was supposed to be a good guy or a bad guy. And the last time I'd heard about wasn't the Munich Olympics and there was like a terrorism thing that happened like slightly before that. So the media was starting to drum up all this like terrorism thing over there. And then, the hostage crisis that went on for like a couple of years. And then the Shah left. And, if you go back and look at that culture before then, and that book that you mentioned, In Search of Zarathustra, I know it has lots of good information about this. It's like women are running around in dresses, smoking cigarettes, their hair down. And then after that regime is over, that's when it became the Dark Ages. They regressed back to like the Dark Ages.
Sure.
And at that time, it's like from there on out, and it probably goes back to even before this. It probably goes back to, Nixon and OPEC and some things like that. But it's like American exceptionalism and America always being involved in this stuff over there has just been a fact of life since then, and it just drills in deeper and deeper every year, and it's just so bizarre to see how it's like it's like a completely different world since then, Right.
Well, we threw away a country which is, would have been our ally, and we wouldn't have had to do almost nothing in the Middle East. They would have done everything just of their own. We wouldn't have to tell them that would have just been natural. This Islamic country, imagine this, an Islamic country largely, an Islamic country, even if he had converted to Zoroastrianism still, it would have been an Islamic country that was a friend of Israel, that was and that friendship, of course, goes back thousands of years to Cyrus and to that sort of thing. And so that was all. It would be a different world today if that had not happened.
Yeah.
And it would have been a better world, in every way, shape, and form. So
all of the conventional propaganda is geared towards educating us that that's a different world over there, and those people are not like us. But what you're doing with this Magian Tarok book, you're demonstrating that no, there is a line of like our culture, our language, and these like really deep archetypes and symbols actually go back to this common source that is in the Persian realm. And I think a lot of people aren't even aware of that like Iran was originally Persia, and the Islamic aspect of that is something that happened really kind of fairly recently in the whole big scope of things.
Right. Yeah, and it was a slow, process of Islamicizing Iran, because, of course, Islam didn't spread the way Christianity did with this. Everybody in this whole territory, this country or whatever, has to be Christian now, just overnight. They would, it was slower, more insidious, but, a whole lot more effective in a way, because people had to, and that was something that, because Islam is largely a Persian invention, not of the country or anything like that, but like, Muhammad's barber, Salman, was a Persian, and it was from him that he probably got most of his ideas about how to do ritual, whatever, about how to reform the Arabic paganism, into a world religion kind of thing. All the kind of details about praying 5 times, all kinds of. But most importantly, the idea, the Zoroastrian idea that you cannot coerce a person into believing the truth. And so, but the Muslims came up with a trick, that we would all understand, which was tax incentives, right? Where they say, okay, we're going to conquer this territory in the name of this caliph or whatever you call this general, and he conquers just like any military person, and his entourage are Muslims, but and then we're going to impose a tax system whereby Muslims are taxed at a much lower rate than non-Muslims. And there's really no incentive on the part of the leader to say, well, it's a win-win. If you don't convert, I get more money. If you do convert, I have more, human resources and that sort of thing. And you can't get a good job. You can't get anything, if you're not, in with the in crowd. So, but so the people over generations, a couple, 3 or 4, eventually did convert, and converted supposedly, it's not coercion. We were just, it's economic coercion or encouragement. But that whole scheme was really a nod to Zoroastrian idea, and they will say, Muslims will say, you do not convert to Islam, you revert to it, because it is the natural, it's the truth, it's the true religion of all mankind, and you are just awakening to it, and that whole argument and way of presenting it is essentially a Zoroastrian kind of way, except the difference is one is just a ruse for a more sophisticated form of coercion, and the other one just completely does not coerce, even argue, you're an idiot for believing that. No, it's just, this is the way, this is the truth, this is what I am, but that's it. No coercion. So, but that's where, Islam really has its origins there. I have a whole thing, I think in my book, The Mazdaism Way, I have a thing about all that, about Islam and Zoroastrianism and that. Also about Nietzsche. I thought that's one of my favorite chapters in that book, about those Zoroastrian dimensions of Nietzsche, that he actually did present many Zoroastrian ideas, even though he himself, he said, of course, his philosophical career began at a moment when he says, Zarathustra passed me by, meaning he went by his, he came into his consciousness and at a sudden moment, and that's what set him off on his whole idea of the eternal return is, again, a Zoroastrian kind of idea. That's that's what I think. It may be possible. We're getting into the deep woods now. May be possible as far as a post-mortem state. And then Nietzsche believed this, because he made side comments, where he didn't write about it in detail, but this idea of the eternal return is kind of a Groundhog Day theory, that you will not be reborn into the future. You will be reborn again in your own generation, in your own lifetime, and you will relive the life you lived. Of course, there will be differences. And he says, the only thing I dread about it is I've got to be with my mother and sister again, because they were like pills. And so he actually, believed that. And I can see that what may be that as we live this life now, when you get these hunches, and think, I don't know if I would go down that alley or not. You know what I mean? I think that's a bad idea. Or any kind of thing that you kind of get a feeling. You don't have a reason for it. You just have something that it may be, we don't remember it, obviously. If we did, we'd be gods for sure, if we knew what stocks to buy and who to bet on at the Kentucky Derby and whatnot. But rather we are reborn to live it. It's like the Germanic idea. Of course, they believe that you'd be reborn in the future and future generations, but you're reborn with certain tools or structures that are your most essential self, but you got to relive it with perhaps hopefully improved, or maybe not. Maybe you'll be worse, but you will. There's something about this life that you will be able to remember, but not in any kind of event-oriented thing, but rather just some subtle feeling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's definitely what he believed. Yeah, exactly. But he definitely did believe that because of these side comments, But I think he didn't want to write about it in detail because he was, trying to be taken serious. He would be an occultist at that point, right?
Right.
And so...
Ouspensky talks about this eternal recurrence thing also, and I think it's probably from Nietzsche. It's probably the influence from Nietzsche, because in what is that book? I can't remember the name of it right now, but he has a...
Who is this we're talking about?
P.D. Ouspensky.
Oh, Ouspensky, uh-huh.
Yeah, In Search of the
no doubt.
That's it. Well, not In Search of the... No, that's not it. I can't remember which book it is, but one of his books, he talks about... he has an essay about Nietzsche's Superman, and then he also has an essay about the eternal recurrence, the idea that you live the same life over and over again. And his one fiction book, or one of his two fiction books that he wrote, The Strange Life of Ivan Osakin, is basically a fictional story about that happening. Like, he meets this guy's at the end of his life, and he's like, I just lived a really shitty life. I made bad decisions about everything, and I regret everything. And then at the end of his life, he meets a magician and this is like the Gurdjieff character in the story,
Mm-hmm.
and the magician says, "I can send you back to live your life over again, but trust me, but you're probably going to make all the same decisions again." And he says,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, let me do it." And so he goes and he lives, and this is the main, the meat of the book is him living his life over again. And even though he's lived it over again, and he knows I got to watch out for this, I got to watch out for that, he ends up doing all the same things again. And so he gets to his life a second time, and to the point where he goes and he meets the magician, and the magician says, "Yeah, so that's what happens. The problem is you need to make, there's some Gurdjieffian lesson about this. You need to become conscious, or you need to make some connection with something beyond, the mechanical course of things." But yeah, I've always thought that's a very Nietzschean influence, because Nietzsche touches on that as well.
Right. I think, oh yeah, that sounds very fascinating. I mean, I didn't know about that fiction book or that, but that is. Yeah, what I kind of came to that, because one of the things it's a personal thing, because I do believe in this kind of reincarnation idea, and I'm getting older and looking ahead of our culture. I kind of get the feeling that from the past, in past times, in previous times, I was thinking, oh boy, I can't wait for the next life, essentially, right? So that you can carry on and do something. It just seems like we're on the verge of something great. I hope, I want to be involved in that. I'm looking forward. I'm optimistic about the future. And now I'm thinking oh my God, I don't want to be in the next world. I don't want to be in a world that's coming up. I would dread that. I'm horrified by that. And that's when I got this thing. It's oh, well, you're going to go right back, and that's why you're going to live right back in the same thing again, and that's what made me feel a little better about the future, past, or whatever. And this guy, one of my mentors, my great mentor in my life, I had 3 or 4 of them, but one of them was a man who was named Bill or William Whitliff, who was a screenwriter, publisher. He taught me, I worked for him just packing books in 1978, 79, right there. And he had his own publishing company and this kind of thing, but he would talk to me about weird, mythic, magical things. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, he talks to me about these things because, he knew I was into that sort of thing. But then I realized, no, he's got a psychic he has, and he goes to the psychic, and he was and then I went to when I found out that he was really into a lot of things, and I went to his memorial service. He just died, a few months ago. And it was oh my God, this big theater in Austin, it holds 2,500 people, whole theater from way back. That thing was packed, completely. And he was a mentor to, people who are these are big shots, right? Big people in the world of Texas culture and everything. And he was their teacher, and he said, he was just this, and he was referred to by every speaker as a magician, a shaman, a seer, this, that, and the other, which is all the things, that I experienced with him. And he, believed in this idea. Well, when I was going through bad times that about, I called him up, once, and he gave me a pep talk, and he left me with his motto that he had at the time, his kind of watchword, which was a Spanish phrase and it's La vida brinca, life jumps. And then I realized later that he was thinking about this idea of something you read about sometimes called quantum jumping, right? Uh-huh. Where you jump from one parallel universe to the other. And I am not speculating here about him, because that's one of the times I was sitting there in his, behind his in his garden at his publishing company, and he said, I'm really fascinated with this idea that we're like in parallel universes, and while we're sitting here talking in some other parallel universe, we could be fighting a duel or something, man. That kind of a thing. So he was like a real believer in these parallel universes. That psychic thing, the one guy, the speakers at his memorial service said he believed he had a psychic, and then that psychic died. And then he went all the way to London to find another psychic to get in touch with his old psychic. But what's so weird about this guy is you think all this kind of stuff, you'd think like, oh my God, this guy's a nut. But this nut, as one of the people memorializing said, every day was for him, Ferris Bueller's day off. Something great's going to happen today. Something stupid every day. And this guy became, and sitting here as a Texana publisher in Austin, Texas, became one of the most renowned screenwriters in Hollywood. But he never went to Hollywood. He stayed right here in Austin. He refused to learn to type. He wrote everything out by longhand, had a typist, and such things like that. I mean, he was just this very unique character. We say, like, I'm going to make it in the film business, and I'm not going to go to Hollywood, and I'm not going to type. I'm not going to do any of these things, and I'm going to make it happen. And he made it happen. He wrote like, you've probably heard of Lonesome Dove, that television series. He, wrote the and that's considered to be the greatest, really Western ever done for the screen. And he wrote that, he wrote the screenplay for it. And so he did astounding things. People say, well, you cannot do this. You cannot do that. I mean, nobody can do that. And he just did it because he said, I can just do it. I'll just make it happen.
Wow.
And so it had a, joyous thing. So he's like one of my remarkable men, that I met.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think that, some of it, when you have contact with them, like Gurdjieff talks about, you don't just read about them or hear about them or read their book or whatever. You've got to meet them, touch them, and 6 words from some higher man, and you're being right there with them, is just life-changing,
Yeah, absolutely.
So he's one,
extraordinary.
One of the few, and we don't have many in our lives, but so
the ones you have, you got to take it when you can get it, and to bring it back to Magian Tarok, and this also has to do with Nietzsche. In the introduction, you spent some time talking about postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
You make the case that there are some good things about postmodernism before it was hijacked by the Marxists.
Right.
Can you talk about that? Because my understanding of postmodernism is that it was like always Marxist. It's always bad. It's always bad. Tell me what's good about postmodernism.
Well, if you go back, there's a book that's good, that I read when I was teaching humanities. I thought, well, I got to learn about this. And so this thing that was used as a textbook back in the 80s called Post Modernist Culture, and it kind of traces the whole thing from the beginnings of the idea, forward. And it's like, well, and when it first started out, it was just a rebellion, like almost Evola-like, revolt against the modern world. It's like, well, there's something wrong with the modern world. It has to be changed, or whether we're undergoing what will be called a paradigm shift. And going back to our example with the Shah and Iran and all that, you see that countries, cultures can revert to the Middle Ages overnight. It happened in Nazi Germany, where you had the most educated, more Nobel Prize winners, most educated, more PhDs per capita than any country in the world. And given the right circumstances, overnight, these people were going back to the Middle Ages on steroids, taking medieval superstitions and nonsense and acting on them, in just an unbelievable way. Iran, most advanced, greatest, Islamic country, no questions as to where, almost like Western country there, again, overnight, back to the Middle Ages, flogging, hanging, all this kind of, overnight. It's possible to shift that way. Mm-hmm. And these things show the idea of the myth of progress is a crock, right? Because otherwise it would just be like plodding along down the railroad track. The more reasonable, logical, educated you become, the further down that track you get. And you don't then just make a quantum leap, 60 miles back on the track. That seems impossible. That's crazy. That's illogical. But it's what happens. And so progress is not occurring that way. We see it demonstrated in history. And, of course, most people were just looking at the early part of the 20th century where you have this First World War that was just like a war over nothing for stupid ideas, millions of people killed, and then the continuation of it, worse than ever, with Nazi Germany and all the other stuff of that. And so the modernism is erroneous. The reason is not the savior,
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at the ancient world, like we're looking back at the Magian world here, we look at the ancient world and we see that there was a whole rainbow of possibilities of different cultures, different philosophies, different paradigms. A whole spectrum of all kinds of paradigms that would interface with one another in places like Greece or in Persia, etc., and cross-fertilize one another, and all kinds of things are possible. But then Christianity comes along, or other monotheistic religions like Islam, and the whole paradigm, all that diversity is reduced to one thing. We can just say there's one answer. We just use the Christian example. Just say there's one answer. It's faith in Christ and the church. These are your answers. There are no others acceptable. That's it. Mm-hmm. But then we come to question that. So this is nonsense, right? It's superstition and silly. We need reason and logic. And in a way return back to a selected part of the ancient world, this idea of Socratic philosophy or whatever.
Yeah.
Which, of course, if we actually went back to Greece at that time, we'd see that these people were considered to be nut jobs, in Athens. Yeah. I mean, these were people on the outs. These were outsiders, and were oftentimes, as Plato was thought to be, he's a reincarnation of Zoroaster or something. He's a weirdo. But, that Greeks were not, promenading about the agora, thinking about great philosophical ideas. We think that's the way they were because that's not what we have selectively plucked out of that culture and made to be the poster of that world, which is not the case. But but we did select it out and say, well, logic, reason, philosophy, using these ideas in a logical, rational way to answer our questions and our problems. That's the birth of modernism, that we will not be saved by faith in Christ and the church, but rather by reason and scientists and science and the academic world. But there's only one answer again. See, it's not a rebirth. The Renaissance was sort of like, but the Renaissance didn't really last, right? It was just a short-lived thing in Florence, certain northern Italian cities. There were probably only 80 men involved in what we call the Renaissance. Again, we selectively pluck those people out, the Leonardo or Botticelli or whatever, and look at them as the exemplars of that time, when really they were, again, a small minority of people. And so, but and the upshot of it is that we get science and logic and reason and that myth of progress over salvation. But what it shares with the myth of the Christian myth is that there's only one true answer, one way only. So it's not a rebirth of the pagan world at all, but some kind of replacement of faith by reason. And so, again, now the 20th century teaches us that's a crock also. You know, reason and logic and science is not getting us where we want to go, where we need to be, etc. So, therefore, that's the shift. We're going to something else that's beyond the modern, that's after the modern, that's postmodern. So the first impetus was that we're going to return to kind of the ancient way, where there's a plethora of answers and all kinds of things and so forth. And all of that was all great and good and would have been a good thing. And what I really think is what postmodernism is or was. But where is all of this occurring? Where is all this thought occurring? Well, in the academia, and it is dominated by Marxists. So they just look at any change, any kind of chaos, any kind of, as an opportunity to insert their one answer, their modern Marxist answer, to these questions, which are equivalent to the the Christian ones. I mean, there's one Savior, one ideology, one paradigm, everything. They're really just as monochromal as any of the others we've mentioned. They're not really postmodern at all. There's nothing unmodern about Marxism. It's a thoroughly modern system. Even by their own thing. We are the correct ones, right? That whole idea of political correctness is a Marxist idea. It's like a mathematical problem, right? It's exactly mathematical that you have the historical dialectic, that there's plus and minus power. You inspired by the Sermon on the Mount, kind of. You see that the powerless will become the powerful. This is ordained by the historical dialectic. Therefore, you always everything is always a conflict between two opposites. Of course, Marx only applied it to economics, but then the cultural Marxists of the academia applied it to everything and have applied it to everything and are applying it to everything, so that anytime you have a plus-minus power paradigm going on, then you are bound to support the minus power person, individual or group or whatever. That's why men can't be, or women can't be sexist, blacks can't be racist, because all these isms all have to do with the minus power people as being victims, as being so Lenin, I think it was, said, either the hammer or the anvil be. And but you see the trickery of it all is that you look and you scratch and see, let's look at academia. Let's look here and there and everywhere. And usually there's like one of these plus power people, a man, a millionaire, this or that or the other thing, that are really plus power people that are in the system and are really manipulating and using in a kind of a demagogue, to blame and demonize people who are really their competition, demonize them for being racist, sexist, homophobe, whatever, when they are really none of those minus power things themselves, but are using this paradigm as another leverage for their continued hold on power.
Yeah.
It's not really the powerless becoming powerful. the powerless are being used by the powerful, certain cadres within the powerful, to hold on to their power.
Yeah. No, it's all based on equality, and it's all based on deposing the people who have the power. There's no pathway of personal, individual success or individual, accomplishment within that whole system. And
right.
When I first heard of postmodernism when I was still in college, which is the late 80s and early 90s, and my friends who were in art students and stuff, and I was taking sociology classes, so people were talking about postmodernism and all this. But this, I think of Derrida, guys like Derrida. Derrida.
Yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah, Derrida. I mean,
mm-hmm.
He has this famous book, The Spectre of Marx, which, is based on a lecture, but he's basically saying that, these guys basically, they saw that, the Berlin Wall came down, and because they were all Marxists. They were all just straight up
mm-hmm.
Marxists. All these French people were Marxists. That's where the term left bank and left wing comes from, because they'd hang out in Paris and talk about how, we're going to, change the world. And,
sure.
When they saw the Berlin Wall come down and everything, and they realized that, behind the Soviet Union's facade of utopia, it was just gulags and
sure.
human suffering, and stuff like that. And so they decided, let's just move everything into the language sphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where right after that, all the PC stuff started coming out after this, and you can't say this and you can't say that. Even in the 90s, I remember that, there was, the real forward-thinking people were not going to write words like he or she in their papers anymore,
Right.
And it's this has just become a regular thing now. It's totally, that's totally expanded into this whole other, gender kind of thing.
Right. Oh, yes, everything. Everything that has that's polar, that like they call binary, right? There's a gender and race and everything, and that's the way they model things, which is Marxist only in the sense that he saw, that there's a economic dichotomy between the workers and the capitalists, and so, and as a lot of his theories and his analysis, as if you will, are perfectly reasonable, and his diagnosis of the problem, it's I can identify the disease, but my solution, of course, he was just a thinker, a dreamer, a philosopher, right? Not really having to live with the implementation of this sort of thing. But I don't think that of course, National Socialism is just another form of socialism, and they embraced socialism. Most people in Germany at the time when the Nazis came to power were socialists, and believed in a lot of these things. They were moving away from religion and everything else, and so they. Whereas Marxism is based on an economic or class model, the Nazis just substituted a biological model, but basically, sought similar structures or theories or whatever, based on biology rather than economics. But the idea that there's somehow an oppressed people. The Germans saw themselves as definitely oppressed, after the First World War, and anybody who's oppressed is going to embrace this kind of ideology, right? As a way of surviving. But the people who are manipulating the system, whether they're wearing brown shirts or whatever these communists wear, these tattered overcoats, whatever, they are gangsters, right? Mm-hmm. They are using this why the Bolshevik is sitting there going, why should I, try to make a company? Why should I cannot do anything. I am helpless. But one thing, if we do have a revolution, our gang will take over the whole damn country, and everything that's in it will be ours.
Mm-hmm.
What a gangster's dream.
Yeah.
Right? And the current people in the Kremlin are just, Bolsheviks who said, this ideology is a drag, right? Yeah. We're really gangsters, so why are we, having to embrace this idiot? That's just keeping us back from doing what we want to do. And now they're just doing what they want to do. Or what's going in China. China is a completely Nazi country. Absolutely.
I was going to ask you about that. What do you think? Have you been watching what's going on in Hong Kong right now?
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, well, that's just, they're just, but they look at what's going on in that whole country. It is the Han people, the Han race, the Han tribe. That's huge, millions, billions of people. But they are the ones. I mean, it's these Tibetans and Uyghurs and these, that, and the other, any kind of minority people are just they're just there for enslavement. So this has nothing to do with Marxism or anything. That's just the reason they embrace it, the reason Cuba embraces it is just to get foreign aid and arms, and they could turn it.
It's a tool for running the government. It's a tool for running the mechanism of government that is in place, right? Like you mentioned, like inequality. That's a big thing with Marxism. And everyone likes to say, well, Marx was right about one thing. There is inequality. But inequality is a natural phenomenon. There's always going to be inequality. And if you could always point to inequality as being a motivation for militarism and social change and changing everything, you always have an excuse for it, because inequality will always exist. We'll never get rid of it. It will never be eradicated.
Right, but Marxism, communism, whatever, any system you want to name that's preaching this stuff, including the people talking on our news programs today.
Oh, yeah.
Washington, D.C., in that area, just a few years ago, 3 decades ago, that was a bunch of bureaucrats. They say, well, you're not going to get rich working for the government. It's like a file clerk, this, that, and the other thing. It's just like really low-paying job. It's like now, Washington, D.C. area is the richest area in the whole country.
Yep.
The federal jobs, they are a royal class, the government class. And those people, and this is it's evolving in that socialist direction. You go to the Soviet Union in the time, and you look down at the street, and what do you see? You see no cars. None, except for the motorcade that goes from fortress to fortress and to dacha in the countryside that are the party members, right? There were never any more than 10% of the people in the Soviet Union were even party members. 90% of the people were not Communist Party members, not because 100% of them maybe didn't want to be, but it was like a honor, you had to prove yourself as a, ideologue or whatever to get in. Not just anybody. It's you're a made man when you're in the party. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing is happening here. These government people, they talk about the deep state and so forth and so on. And that's one of the things that I can't remember his first name, is an Italian guy named Grimaschi, who said, and he was a Marxist, and some of the new right people, picked up on his theories and said, his strategy is the one. He says, you control the bureaucracy of a country, you control its educational system, its media, okay, and you wait, and keep plugging away, and you will win. You will take that over. And I think that goes back to times in Babylon or whatever. How did the Akkadians, take over from the Sumerians? What happened to the Sumerians? Well, they were subsumed by their bureaucrats,
Yeah.
I mean, the bureaucrats took them over.
I mean, that's like Russia. Russia before the revolution, before the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was a huge bureaucracy. They were one of the biggest bureaucracies in Europe. And so they just took over that mechanism. They took over that structure, and then that's it. It's like Ireland, like up through the 10th century, was all like under the 2F system, right? They had no bureaucracy, no centralized government whatsoever. So the British can never take them over. They kept trying to fight them and take them over, but they couldn't do it because one king would say, well, I can't vouch for the whole country, or they'd make promises they couldn't keep. And so they started to call the Irish, they'd all break their promises, right? Well, it's because they had no central authority. They had no structure, no centralized bureaucracy. Eventually they did get a centralized bureaucracy, and then they got conquered. It's that simple. But they tell us that we need a strong bureaucracy to keep us safe from foreign invaders. But the reality is, the more ingrained your bureaucracy is, the easier it is for a foreign invader to take you over. They just need to go, hey, who's in charge here? When the aliens land, take me to your leader.
Yep, that's like globalism, like the economy, right? Global economy. Well, that's a bad idea because it's like that's why you'll have worldwide economic crisis, et cetera, and so forth. Well, in ancient times, there were whole countries that rose and fell, and whole countries were wiped out by disease and famine, and the other countries didn't even know those countries existed, let's be affected by it, you know what I mean? So, there was a lot of cells of culture all across the globe, and there was rising and there was falling, and they were all disconnected from one another, and that was all. Some of them were great, some of them not so great, but there was always hope, right? There was always some place to go or some source of greatness as they cross-fertilized one another, just like I was talking about the ancient world and its spectrum of diverse paradigms and so forth, each one cross-fertilizing and feeding the others and so forth. And so new things could come up, they could affect one another, but you start to homogenize and centralize everything, then one germ can kill everybody. One calamity economically or biologically or you name it, can destroy the whole thing. Same thing. I mean, it's the same kind of paradigm. Exactly that we're talking about, like with your Irish example, or that's exactly what happens. So, that's one of my ideas, or not my idea, but the advantage of moving people in the direction of thinking tribally, right?
Yeah.
And trying to reinstitute the tribal idea so that you say, well, this is our thing, this is our group, and we have, cultivate our own separate culture. We interact with others. It wasn't like there were certain cultures are not so good. I mean, that most as Indo-Europeans, we generally, if we're not schooled by some ideology to the contrary, we generally are kind of xenophilic. We like foreign things. We like exotic things. We thrive on traveling, interacting with, and receiving people from other places. Now, other cultures, kind of see, well, our thing is the only thing, and anything from the outside is a pollution or a threat or whatever. And nomadic peoples who are nomadic at their most archaic core are generally, not subject to that. It's just not, not right. I mean, it just doesn't feel right. But mostly people who live on rivers, like the Egyptians. Remember the Egyptians the soldier, why they could never have an empire outside of Egypt generally, was like they believed that if you died as a soldier or whatever on foreign soil, you were like doomed to hell. You know, you were not going to have a happy afterlife or whatever if you died in a foreign land. So it can't be. They couldn't raise and get an enthusiastic army to go anywhere, because they said this is the world. The Nile is the world. And the same thing as most people who live around the Mesopotamian region, they kind of had a similar thing. These river, you know, this idea of holy land, right? That this is a holy land. Whereas the Indo-Europeans, as I read about a kind of Celtic example again, there's a great book by two brothers, Reese brothers, called Celtic Culture. And it's kind of Dumasilian kind of thing to a great extent. But they talk about this really cool idea, how Ireland, you know, this idea that it's 5 provinces, 4 clear, but then there's a center. There's a center and then 4 outlying regions. And they call them the fifths, right? The fifths of Ireland. It's divided into 5 areas. But this is a thing that people did, nomadic type people, that they would say, okay, we're just wandering around out here on the steppe or wherever, and then, we're going to sit down here for a while. Well, we just kind of unfold our universe. We got a center and 4 regions around us, right? And we just unfold it and say, here's the homeland. Well, we don't like it here anymore. Pick up, kind of fold it back up and truck on down the road and go to a whole different world, and then unfold it again. The homeland is where we put the pole down and unfold the universe, Yeah. And that's the home. That's probably the way, why we can, and why as Americans we just come to a new place and that's it. Now this is our ancient homeland or wherever. We just don't feel like we were not have to go back to Jerusalem or whatever, to really be at home.
So I have to ask you if this relates to any of this, Zurvanism and the Zurvanite heresy.
Yeah.
What is the Zurvanite heresy?
What is the Zurvanite heresy? Well, it's the idea that one is unfree. You just can relate to that, I'm sure. That is that there is a mechanistic, astrological time. Zorvan is time. Right, and that it's how is time measured is the movement of the mechanism of the universe, the mechanism, and so a lot of it is historically an influence from the Mediterranean world, from the Greek world, etc., who were kind of believers in that sort of thing, whereas the Zoroastrian people and the idea was that there's a creator of time. Right, the time is a tool or a mechanism that is like a tool for divinity to use, but it is not the divinity itself. We're not subject to it unless we choose to be enslaved by it. And so Zurvan, the concept of Zurvan is in the, in the Sirosas and so forth. I mean, there's there a couple of times, and it's just a word in the old texts, but it's not a god, right? But it becomes that under the influence of people who were mechanistically oriented. And these are typically they were. I don't know how much the Egyptians were, but certainly the Mesopotamians were, right? The idea, like in Egypt, with the rising and falling of the Nile, that there's a cycle of times. That's reality. And in Mesopotamia, these these cycles of time and astrology and all of that sort of thing, being that if you understand these mechanisms, then you understand the world. That's essentially the body of God, or the body of the divinity. Whereas, you see something like, again, the Indo-European people didn't, they navigated by the stars, whether it was on the sea or more typically on the land. When you're on the steppe and it's just a sea of grass, right? So, that's good to navigate by. But to say you are determined by it is a different thing. And you see that, for example, where like with Christianity, for example, you see that the mechanism is important. That, for example, the date on which Easter is celebrated, when the one of the big things when the Celtic Church, so-called, there's a different, has some differences with the Roman Church, and when they started, when they amalgamated them, two of the most important things, or the two most important things, that the Roman Church demanded was that the Celts celebrate Easter on the right day, according to the mechanism, which is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. That's how you determine what Easter is. And so that's what they did. That's what they enforced. But typically, when you look around the world, in the European world, you see like, well, where is this going to? It's a natural thing. So that, for example, the Day of the Dead, of the ancestors and that sort of thing, in the Celtic world is what we just had was Samhain, right? Which is, first part of November, end of October by our reckoning. The same thing in the Germanic world is in the winter solstice time. That is the end of December. Same kind of celebration, same thing. But one is earlier. Why? Because the Celts are Central European people, and the Germanic peoples are Northern European. So there's a difference as far as nature is concerned as to when the natural phenomena take place from region to region, place to place. It's not a mechanism. It's an organic, biological, visceral reality which we experience. How is spring determined? Not by a mechanism of the stars, but, for example, when does the first violet appear in this sacred grove, for example? There it is. There's the first violet. It's spring. It's time. Nature has determined when spring has arrived at our place. So it's local, it's organic, it's real. Because, we're going to have to plant crops. We're not going to say, well, it's springtime, time to do this. And it's like if you're in Minnesota and you're up to your ass in snow, no, it's not spring. It's not. It's by mechanism it is, but not by nature. And so going back to the question of Zurvan is the mechanism. It's universal, it's global, it's mechanistic. And so but it's not based on the actual inner experience of the tribe, the person, the individual, etc., and so forth.
Well,
again, it's a violation of freedom.
Aspect of it?
Well, it violates the freedom of the individual, of the tribe, of all those things. It enforces a coercion. It's coercive.
Uh-huh.
It's cosmically coercive. It limits one's freedom. It says, well, that's it. I'm fated. This is the way it is. It's written, so it is written. So I got to submit, to the thing. So it's more of a something that can be used by people that want to use such things to, coerce individuals or others. And it was never, really when people look at Zoroastrian and say, well, there never was even a Zurvanism, really. It seems to have been a construct of scholars more than anything. It might have been and nothing more than an influence of Mediterranean or, Greco-Roman thinking on the Persians as they would, accept anything. Look at anything and say, well, that's interesting, so forth. And, it was attractive to the, for example, the whole story of going back to the Magi, that there is why I said, well, these Magians were Zurvanites, some people would say. And how do you think that and know that? Well, it's because they were so into the astrological, that is, mechanisms in the sky, right? But what they were, and this is something that somebody would need to take up, it's like a huge thing that could be, some people know it, some people know about it, and in Iran and wherever. But the idea of the what kind of astrology did these people practice that was so important? Well, some of it was, mechanistic. Probably the Star of Bethlehem, so-called, is probably a conjunction in a conjunction of stars in a certain constellation, in the constellation of Aries, let's say, because each constellation would have a country or region ascribed to it, so that if a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus or whatever took place in the constellation of Aries, then they would determine that a Sayushant is born in Israel somewhere. See? And so that's the kind of a thing, the Zurvanite thing. But what they were, that's part of it. But what a lot of the practice was, and that's what these temples, these star observatories that are on mountaintops in the Iranian world from ancient times, and a lot of the prayers and the idea that they had this the fire temple, the fire is burned eternally there on these temples, and they were attended around the clock by priests. And so what did they do when they were attending the fire? Well, part of what they did otherwise was they watched the skies. Mm-hmm. And what they were watching for are all kinds of really remarkable phenomena. That is, things like comets, things like novas or other things. They would just scour the skies constantly, just like a meditational thing, and observe strange phenomena. Who knows what they saw? Who knows? There could be space brothers flying in. Who knows? But, they saw things and they recorded them, and they said, that's a portent. But it wasn't necessarily a mechanistic, predictable portent, but rather just a weird phenomenon, like the one I experienced when I was 5 years old, when I saw the occultation of Venus. It's recorded or shown in my book, the History of the Rune Guild, which is a lot autobiographical, and I actually have a thing my mother saved from the newspaper, our local newspaper in Denison, Texas, because this phenomenon is where in this case, Venus, usually it is Venus, or because it's the only big planet that, could do this, really. The moon comes in front of it, and from our angle, it's right there on the rim of it, And what this did was the most remarkable, I've never seen anything like it even in photographs of any kind, and that is that it was a crescent moon, and this planet, this planet, what we learned later, was right on the point of the crescent.
Mm.
And when it hits that, it's like these kind of things, like what you see with the eclipses of the sun, where like boom, there's just like really looks like a bright light. Like something is like, it's not just sitting there, but it rayifies, and it just looks like an explosion, really. And that's what this newspaper article points out. So people were thinking that the Russians, this is 1959, the Russians had exploded an atomic bomb on the moon. That's what this newspaper article said people were thinking, that that's what happened. Now, this was not visible except in certain, like a little swath of the land, right? This would not be, this is in Denison, Texas, in far northern Texas right there, and that would just be visible there or, along a line, but not necessarily in Dallas or in Oklahoma City or wherever else, because that, you imagine the miraculous nature of something, that the star is a point, or the planet is a point of light, and that point of the crescent moon is also just a point. How many infinite numbers of points are there in the night sky? Mm-hmm. And if these two things would come together, point to point, and do this scene, is the kind of thing, what I'm saying here about the priests, is that that's the kind of thing they would see and think that is something big's happening, and so they would put these things together, Venus, the moon, as far as the meaning and where it occurred, what constellation was the moon in at the time, and that sort of thing. But it's not mechanistic. You can't predict these things. I guess you can, but you don't know what it's going to look like, I think.
Yeah.
Because nobody ever talks about it. I heard one time at somewhere Boston station, we got a lot of different stations, and some weatherman was talking about, well, tonight something weird's going to happen with the moon and Venus, But that was, of course, just for there. But I tell you, when I saw it, and I was just a little kid, and, it was life-changing.
Wow.
That was my first kind of Runa, experience. It was strange.
Yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing where I'm saying this is not, mechanistic. This is like people looking, miraculous, seeing, and it's like an omen,
Yeah.
But that, see, it can't be predicted. The Zurvanite thing is like, we want to know about when the conjunctions will take place and in what constellation will they take place. We can predict these things. We can manipulate these things. We can use them in propaganda or anything else. But it's all a mechanism.
Yeah.
But then things like novas and comets and these occultations and other things are things you have to observe, and experience. And that's more free, wild.
For me, so tell me where I'm going with this. So, like Zurvanism, here's my conception of it, is that the Mazdaism, the basic understanding of it is that there's a Hura Mazda, and there's this conception of consciousness, and individual consciousness. Individuality is born, right? And then there's like this opposing force, that rises up in response to that, undermine you, right? There's like mechanicalism or evil, right? There's a sense of evil. And Zurvanism comes in to say, oh, no, wait, time created both of these things. Father Time created both of these. So he created consciousness and he created anti-consciousness. He created them both. So they're just going to struggle against each other forever and really need to watch out for time. So then it's like, oh, well, everything is dualism, right? Everything's dualism. You can't have darkness without the light. You can't have light without the darkness,
Right, but that's wherein in Zoroastrianism and in Mazdaism, the dark and the light, in their sense, are not equal. That is, the light precedes the darkness. The darkness is an anomalous interloper and is inferior to, and because it's a lack, right? It's a lack of light.
Mm-hmm.
Just like with the way that, and this is where probably like Plato is like channeling or, receiving this kind of thing from Persian philosophy, that evil is a lack of good. Good, like the agathon, there's no, in, Platonism, there's no anti-agathon, right? It's the equal, and the equal polar opposite of the agathon. The agathon is up there as the one, the light, the truth, and all that, and then it's like a light that comes down, and it just eventually gives out and becomes darkness because there is a lack of light, and it's the lack of light, lack of being, which is evil. That is, it's detrimental to and contrary to the interests of the light. Mm-hmm. And so they're not equal. They're not like that makes sense. It makes sense to the mind, to the conscious, to the logical mind, that you would say, like, this idea of there's time, and then there's two suns of time, one dark, one light, and all that kind of thing. It all makes good sense. It seems to make logical sense, and it doesn't really stretch our imaginations. We don't need to stretch our imaginations to understand it. Whereas the Mazdan mythology or paradigm is something that really, you gotta it doesn't necessarily make sense on the surface of it. You have to sort of experience it in order to say, well, that's what it is. But it also, the Zurvanite thing, part of the problem of it is just that it limits the freedom of the individual. Because consciousness, so you are free, and we are both familiar with a philosophy wherein, say, freedom of the isolate intelligence, that is the good. Yeah. And things that are the tetragrammaton, being nature, being a mechanism, and then nature is a machine, is an organism, however you want to, whatever metaphor you want to use, it's not free. And so Ahura Mazda is freedom, is liberation, is the liberation of the individual mind, of the divine mind to create something which is unimaginable, otherwise. And that's why, Zurvanism is heretical to me, and I think to Zoroastrians. I had a Zoroastrian, guy, Parsi, in one of my classes way back in German class. And he was a big guy and everything, and he was like from India, obviously, so there were other Indians in his class, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, so something came up, in class, and he said, oh, I'm not Hindu. And I said, oh, I know you're a Zoroastrian. He said, how do you know? How do you know that? It's like, if you're not that, you're probably this, it could be a few other things. And then he came by my office and talked to me regularly. And at the time, I was reading like Zahner and people, like he was into the Zoroastrian, Zurvan, those books, and I was reading in them. And I said, well, what about Zurvan? And he just looks at me kind of like with a sour look on his face and say, yeah, he wasn't a religious guy. He could tell me all kinds of weird stories about the religion, but, he wasn't, really into it. And he goes, well, I don't know. He says, Zurvan, he is a demon or something. I mean, that's just like, he's sort of vague, but it's not a big thing, but it's certainly not a good thing. I mean, he knew it, he's heard it, but it was bad. It was evil. It's an evil thing. So, but like Zahner and made a big deal out of it. And then I think Zahner retracted, a lot of his stuff. I was in error in my interpretation of a lot of his stuff when when the Zoroastrians explained to him why this is not, show me the Zurvanism, show me, the texts, so show me, not that they didn't exist. Like we see some art, there's one of these things in Hinnell's book on Persian mythology where he has a picture, that's obviously Zurvan, where you see the two entities coming out of his shoulders, and then on the side of each one of them are like, the whole army or line of sort of misshapen creatures, that are like on the side of Arman, and then very splendid, good-looking creatures on the side of Hormuzd, So, I mean, it exists. It's a myth.
One thing that always happened is that Anton LaVey always had people saying, so Satan, that word, is just a Christian creation. So if God, really created it, then aren't you doomed to fail? Eventually, Dr. Aquino talks about this as like the stacked deck paradox, right?
Yeah.
Talks about the stacked deck paradox that, really, God, if you're worshiping Satan, well, God created that, so you're going to lose eventually, right? You're ultimately under His will, this creation of that, and that's what Zurvanism sounds like to me. It's like representing that, And,
I think that's. I think that's a good analysis there. That's very similar. But that's like what you have in the case of both Ahura Mazda and like the Satan of Mike Aquino or of even of Anton LaVey really, is say, well, these are not. We don't believe in or give credence to the Christian mythology at all. I mean, this thing is something else, and that's where Dr. Aquino says, okay, he defines Set as virtually the same thing, even though he certainly didn't know anything about or had no interest in Zoroastrianism or the details of, Zarathustra's ideas that way. So it's not that he got that from that, no, but that his definition and that Zarathustra would have given to Ahura Mazda are virtually the same thing. And both are really saying that these entities of the individual mind, or kind of a psyche, and that from which that individual thing is derived, the cosmic prototype of that thing, which would be Ahura Mazda, Lord Wisdom, which of course doesn't mean the Lord of Wisdom or whatever. It means Lord Wisdom, meaning Lord control, wielding, and wisdom. But that's masculine, and wisdom, a feminine noun, meaning consciousness or thought. And so it's like a yin-yang concept of the power. Well, what the later the Tantrism it talks about Shiva and Shakti being the power and the power holder, power and the power wielder, right? Mm-hmm. This is kind of like wisdom and the wisdom wielder. Or consciousness and the consciousness user as a single entity, but as already a bifurcated entity, that there's two parts of it. And that's, of course, part of the physics of the cosmos, that there is this duality. All dualities aren't good and evil. That's just one of them, that's there. But that there are natural or other, all kinds of dualities, and here we have to start with two. One doesn't do anything, right? The Greeks or the Greek philosophers said the one is like what we think of as zero, right? Because if there's no other part of it, then it's just like one thing. It's just one thing, and there's no other. So therefore, it is akin to or equivalent of our concept of zero. And so they really have to have two things in order to have many things. As any computer scientist will tell you, right? You get 0 and 1, and you go into infinity from that point on. You can do anything with that. But you have to have those two terms in order to do that. And so those, being a potent creator, Ahura Mazda has to have this polarity within it. And so that's what I'm thinking about those concepts there. But that's, again, I think that it's a problem that is more historical or literary than it is something that was actually something that plagued or Zoroastrian thinking or ideas. I mean, things like Mazdaism, the Mazdakians and that kind of thing. Though those are real things that were real organizations and real movements within Zoroastrianism and so forth. Social, political, and all kinds of things. But Zurvanism is just a mode of thinking that is just auxiliary. You know what I mean? It's not really in competition with it, with orthodoxy, but is just so kind of like the way Kabbalah is in Judaism. I mean, I knew this guy who's a fan. When my first wife she was Jewish, and she had all these Russians and Austrians and all these kind of old people, family members. There's one guy. His name was, or he went by the moniker in the family of Uncle Zeta, which is kind of a weird name because Zeta means like grandfather, so he's like Uncle Grandfather. And he was an Orthodox kind of guy, and he was did Kabbalah, and he was like in his 80s or something when I met him, and he was the real thing. But he said, like we just meet, at the synagogue or wherever, but it's not part of the religion. It's something else, Mm-hmm. And they don't, the rabbi doesn't really like what we do, he's like, but, it's just, it's totally Judaic in their way they approached it. And it wasn't thought to be, oh, that's terrible, you need to stop that. But rather it's just a side thing, right?
Yeah.
Now there's some sects like the Lubavitch or, the Hasidim and all this kind of stuff, they, really make it more of a central part. But I think that's kind of the way that Zurvanism was in Zoroastrianism, even though it's totally forgotten now, except by scholars. But such as it existed, it was just a Mediterranean influence.
Yeah,
of mechanistic, astrological fate, the orientation toward, which is so dominant in the Greco-Roman world, the idea that fate, ruled everything.
Yeah.
The wheel of fortune.
Always a thing. I mean, the whole concept of fate always comes up when people start talking about, whenever you have a question about what am I doing in life, what am I doing? Was this meant to happen, or am I paving the way? And it's always a philosophical question, but I found that I think if you approach things with from a basis that it is possible for you to succeed and to create and things like that, then that is more desirable. And maybe that's just like a thing that comes down to left-hand path versus right-hand path. It's like that's the way I went and found things out and everything. And maybe some people don't need that. Some people want to know, They want to just be told, hey, everything's fine, We got it all under control. They want to know that there's a plan. It's stressful for them to think.
Right. It gives you a sense of if an authoritative figure tells you everything will be okay, or this is the apply these things and do these things and everything will turn out all right, that you will but of course they usually are using those ideas to control you, but at the same time, even if you say, well, let's not do that, let's not let that into the picture, but rather say simply that the idea that there is that you're preordained to be a great man, that's a magical way of thinking. And like I was talking about that Bill Whitliff and his psychic thing, he wanted a psychic, I think, to tell him, you can do it. It's written in the stars. It's gonna work for you. And then when you believe that, you get a kind of an energy and the belief that in face of all odds, I will succeed. I've been told this. I believe this. I believe that I am a man of destiny. And so those are powerful myths, personal myths to use for, magical purposes. And so that there's not that it's silly or stupid or anything like that. No, it is powerful, and so forth. But there's a big difference, or either a difference without a distinction or a distinction without a difference between like the Germanic way of thinking of fate, of Urmuk, and the Indian idea of karma and that sort of thing, that is that we make our own fate, even if it could actions that we did in past lives even are going to, but it's our doing. We made our beds and we're sleeping in them now. But we created it. We made it happen through our actions, and the reactions to our actions are the fruits which we are reaping now from our past actions. That kind of belief, that's the Germanic kind of way, and perhaps the Indian and whatever. But the Greco-Roman world would have this idea of the mechanism, that there is a star, that you were born at this time, that you were, your soul, like the way that astrology was supposed to work traditionally, was that the soul fell from the firmament, from up beyond the stars, came down through the planets as it was going to enter your soul, was going to enter into the womb of your mother and reunite with that body, but it's going to pick up certain characteristics and traits depending on where the planets were as you fell through those planetary spheres. And there you picked up all of these things, and you're in there, and you didn't do it, Somebody just shot you out of a barrel up there, and you went through this stuff, and, it was all ordained. And depending on when that happened, in time, is how you are going to be configured. And you're either doomed or destined, depending on the stars.
Yeah.
And so it is written. It is written. It is a done deal. Yeah. And so, and you see that there's a linguistic component to this, in the sense that the Germanic language doesn't have a future tense, really. I mean, we say, I will go, but there is nothing future about will, and there's nothing future about go. It's just, we just conventionally understand that that's going to take place in some non-past present time. But in Latin, Greek and Latin languages, Latinate languages, Romance languages, there's a definite future tense. There's a verb form which is future, So that the idea that the future is fixed, it has a form, is more visceral, in those languages than it is in ours.
So is there a tense for that? Is there a tense for that in English? Is there an equivalent for that?
Well, we have a future tense, but it says I went, I go, and I will go. Mm-hmm. But see, I went, that's a definite form. And I go, that's a definite form. But I will go, or I could just say, I am going tomorrow. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. I mean, I understand that tomorrow is in the future, in the not yet happened. But there's no definite, concrete form for that concept. And there's different ways you could go about getting at that concept, but it's not fixed. See. Mm-hmm. And so you see that the norns, the names of the norns in Germanic, are urður, that which has become, that is past. Verðandi, that which is becoming, which is turning, which is happening now, at this present moment, past, okay, it's already gone. It then skuld, that which ought to happen or should happen. But you notice that, well, you couldn't notice it because it's not transparent, but urður and verðandi are derived from the same verb, verða, to become or to turn. Same verb, two forms of the same verb. Skuld is just a completely different verb, and that's really common in the triadic arrangement of symbols of all kinds in the Germanic world, is that you'll have three things, two are similar, one is different.
Yeah.
To
become, which relates to like kefir, right?
Yes, well, it's a different, that's, and of course that verb can mean becoming or being also, so it's, so that, but I'm not sure, but I imagine in Egyptian there is a definite future, tense. Most languages have that. It's, but I think that it's, part of the Germanic strength or whatever about why it was Germanic peoples who put people on the moon. You know what I mean? Yeah. Is that they said, the future is something we can make. It's not predetermined. It's not fixed by some outside force or whatever, but we make it happen. We make it. So, therefore, let's, in the words of Jim Morrison or whatever, let's make the myths.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's so awesome. Well, Dr. Flowers, thank you so much for coming on again and all of this, and for giving us this great book, the Magian Tarok. I hope everyone who's listening to this buy this book. It's important, and it will make you a smarter person. Yeah.
Yep, that's. I hope that's.
Do you have any final words for us?
Well, no. I'm always working on new things. I tell you, I produce quite a bit, and then I sometimes I just get off on a tangent and write another book. It's like my retribalization book. That's going to be coming out very soon with Arcana Europa Press. Awesome. And then I just got a contract for a new book called The Runic Revival with Inner Traditions. And it's a sort of, it takes the Runic Revival both from the scholarly standpoint, about how the runes were sort of rediscovered and the whole history of scholarship there, as well as the esoteric. So no one has ever written a book about either one of those topics, but much less about those two things together and how they interweave and don't interweave is the other really interesting part of how the scholarly understanding of runes and the esoteric or magical one were more often than not just completely alienated from one another, and how that's really a lamentable situation, but how we're coming back to doing this. And then I'm making great progress on one of my big books, which is on Nazi occultism, where I will tell my take on that whole thing, which will be surprising to most people because you don't, what was there is not what people think was there. I mean, we really, so many books have been written that have these crazy hobby horse theories, about, it was the Cathars, or it was the this, or the Spear of Destiny, and other just wildly kooky, sectarian kind of interpretations, when in fact the real story, is far more engaging, interesting, and useful, powerful, not so much as something that we can use, but rather something we can understand and not be taken in by similar kinds of things in the future. Much of what we call branding and logo, like the use of logos, branding, and that sort of a thing, were really pioneered by National Socialism and such things as the use of ritual. And sometimes we still use their rituals. The Olympic torch lighting ritual that everyone loves and watches, that is a completely Nazi invention. They said this is a liturgical thing that they invented for the Berlin Games, and it says, wow, that is great. That is so wonderful.
Wow.
We're just going to do it forever. And but it's just completely invented by them. But that's what they would do. And so you can see, part of how these things like that worked and why they worked. And then you say, well, and also people don't look at occultism from the standpoint of actual what define what occult means. So that is either something which is something that's formally established that's become disestablished and therefore rejected knowledge, or it's stuff that people haven't accepted yet. For example, the use of psychology or this kind of branding thing and using the irrational mind. And if anybody reads Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, you say, this guy is spilling the beans all the time, right and left in there, because I think he didn't
he said everything. He explained everything.
Right. But even things like, we will have, torchlight, or things at night. Why do we do that at night? Because the mind is more receptive to impressions at night than it is during the day. So we're going to, she's telling me, I'm going to do black magic on you right here, and we're going to be lapping it up, I mean, we're going to love it. And so, but he's telling people, this is why I'm having these torchlight parades at night and all that sort of thing, because I'm going to be working on your mind. But not like people think, like, I'm sitting there chanting to the devil or something to make you, which is, something that was about in the German culture at the time. Think of all the films in the silent era about some mastermind who's manipulating the masses, mass mind, or like Caligari and his Caesar, or Dr. Mabuse, or the Golem, you name it. I mean, it's just like everything, one after the other, this idea of controlling the environment through magic and that sort of thing was just out there. But one of the main things is people don't realize about the whole movement and the whole world of that culture was that it's all really part of the great reform movement in Germany, wherein it started about 1880, and where every kind of thing in the social, cultural world was open to new ideas and ideas of reform. But as things like for today, we think of like go to a class or whatever on the environment and ecology, and they'll tell you like, oh, well, what, you've got, these Japanese honeysuckle plants, you got to get rid of that. That's an invasive species, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, well, that's sort of the Nazis sort of invented that idea as an invasive species. It's the very idea of it. And then it's like, well, they extrapolated from that or use the same theory and say, well, in culture and history and society, the good is the ecosystem, which is natural and is just within itself, authentic, real, and so you're going to have invasive species like foreigners, like gypsies and Jews and whatever, and these are unhealthy to the organism of the culture, and so have to be eradicated in order to make the culture healthy again. But that there's whole books written about the green movement, and its roots in National Socialism and so forth. So you have to watch out. I mean, any human, think about the things you adopt as a concept and an operating principle in your life, and where's this stuff going to lead, maybe?
Yeah.
What are the, keep going on down the road with this idea and see where does it end up, just like socialism ending in, without fail, in totalitarianism. Somebody's got to call the shots. Somebody's going to plan your life, and you're going to have to submit to it,
That's what I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about Post Modernism, how it overcame modernism. To me, that's kind of like progressivism, right? And progressivism to me is like, and I had a guy on the show a little while back who had like grown up in like Soviet Russia and like emigrated here like in the 70s, and he's like, it's like progressivism is when they take science and they say science is how we're going to like run society, and the progressives say, well, we know what's the best thing for society, so we're just going to tax everyone, take all the money, and we're just going to do whatever we need to do, and it's for everyone. It's for the best interest of everyone, who's concerned. And we know what's best. We're going to take the money and we're going to do, and the people are just going to like go along with it. And it's like the basis of that. You can still see that like the manifestations of that occurring in the green movement today. Mm-hmm. But I mean, at the time that National Socialism took over, I mean, it was like progressivism in America was very, very eugenics and everything was like a part of it.
Well, that's
how
where
we're going to make a better future for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And, that the same thing like appeared in National Socialism at the time.
Yes. Well, that's where Hitler got most of his ideas on eugenics from the Americans. The Americans had a much more advanced eugenics program, much more implemented and all that sort of thing than anything in Germany. And he just, took that basically, over. And and one of the things you have to do when you're thinking about something like national, it's like people say, oh, he's a Nazi, Nazi this, Nazi that. It's like, well, what is Nazism? What is National Socialism? So part of like with my Lords of the Left-Hand Path, I said, well, you got to start with some pretty definite definitions in order to understand what it is we're talking about. So, I put in there what most people don't even know exists, and that's the 25 points of National Socialism. And, and how from that, a lot of things, everything falls into place. One of the big things that's written there, one of the things people don't realize is how much it was based on the socialism part was like based on the abolition of the payment of interest and of the use of interest as lending money for interest was going to be abolished, and that was the reason. And Churchill says in his memoir, so that is the reason why Germany had to be stopped and eradicated, because that would have ended the whole, the goal. And this goes beyond it. It goes into an esoteric level. The guy, Walter Johannes Stein, who was the guy that was the mentor of the guy who wrote The Spear of Destiny, believed that the world monetary system was the equivalent of the Holy Grail, and that there was like an esoteric dimension to that. Mm-hmm. And, that was like the system that would continue to feed, everyone who mattered, forever in a kind of a magical way. And the Nazis said, we have to abolish, the payment of interest to either, anyone, involved. It had to be abolished.
Well, that's in Islam too. Like the Quran says, that charging interest is evil. You cannot charge interest against other Muslims, but you can charge interest against pagans. You can charge interest against Persians and everyone who's not a Muslim.
Anybody who's not Muslim, yeah. But that's a thing, and I don't know how practical. I mean, the use of that's what capitalism is really all about, right? I mean, it's like this idea that there's that you're making money without doing anything, just by having money and then lending it, whereby the person has to pay you for the convenience of having the money up front, and then you pay them twice as much over time, for the money that was lent to you. And that they're not producing anything. That was a criticism that Germans had in general about London-style capitalism, is that it's not, what we see all around us today is that people are making money without doing anything other than moving paper, right? That's a kind of a disease. If you're like, well, I need money, I need some money up front for my invention, this automobile idea, and I'm going to build automobiles, sell them, and then I'll pay you back. But I need some money right now to get that project off and running. Oh, that's good, right? I mean, that moves society. Things are actually happening. But if you're doing like hedge funds and this moving futures and pork belly futures, and, it's just that nothing is happening. It's just like a casino of some kind.
Well, the only way that people manipulate that in an unethical way is through like the power of a central authority to say that, you can't lend to some people or you can't lend to, because otherwise, I mean, if there's just a completely free market, I mean, a bank would lend to whoever, hey, you got a good idea? Well, if it's a good idea, I'll lend to you, But, I mean, no one is, obligated to lend to someone, just because, they have to, right? It should all be, free. It should all be, a free decision to, do that. And, interest, you just charge interest because, well, why am I going to give you money, right? If my fucking brother or something or someone in my family's like, hey, I need money for blah, 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 okay, I'll give you money. But if I'm an organization and someone's like, I want to borrow money from you, well, we need to know why, and we want to make a good decision about whether we're going to get our money back.
Right. But also so they'll say, what's your...
America happened in 2007, 2008, because the government intervened and said, no, we're going to secure you, right, to make loans to people who don't deserve loans, right?
Right.
And so they made loans to people who had no, evidence that they're ever going to pay it back, and then they didn't pay it back, and then the whole system crashed as a result.
But those poor people were sucked into, by people saying, you can get a house, you can do this. It's like, they didn't know, what was happening to them. But so they were, it wasn't like they were sinister. It was the banks that was sinister. And then they'll also...
There's a coercive force. There's a coercive force behind it,
And they'll take and they want collateral.
The only reason the government can come in and say, we're going to back you up is because we're coercively stealing money from millions of Americans through their taxation. I mean, it's our taxes paid for all of that bullshit, So... ultimately,
yeah, and then they get collateral, so that you have to put your property up to secure it or whatever. Then they're just going to confiscate that property when you can't pay. Now, a lot of times or not a lot of times, but sometimes it really backfires when you say, like, uh-oh, we got a whole city like Detroit. It's like, we're just going to bulldoze these neighborhoods because, like, nobody wants these houses ever again, so that they can actually just. But most of the time, it's like, well, we're safe. The bank's safe either way. We either get the money with all that interest, or we get the property.
Yeah.
So it's all going to come
they win either way.
Back to Papa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But well, it's like one of the basic things in the 25 points of the party, the Nazi Party, was like two things. Was one, the abolition of the bondage of interest. That was like written in big capital letters, and then also the idea that's just saying, the common good before the individual good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And then who determines what the common good is? Well, of course, the party decides. And that's true of, that's socialism, whether it's National Socialism or Bolshevism or whatever. That's universal in socialism.
Right.
And it's always who decides is going to be the in crowd, right? I mean, the party members, the government, whoever. I mean, however that's defined, there's going to be this Politburo, which is all these people who are the arbiters of that, and it's people that say, well, why would I favor a socialist system? Well, I always envision myself as being part of that in crowd.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so that's where the gangsterism comes in. I'm going to be in the catbird seat, and everybody else is going to be a rube.
Yep.
Yeah. But I'm never going to say that, of course. I'm always going to be, equality and whatever, sort of moral platitudes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's really important to the manipulation, is that you seem to be, like Sun Tzu, say, okay, he's talking about a battlefield, really, but, you take the high ground, right? Meaning getting on a hill and fight downhill. But you take that metaphorically and you say, like, well, you always take the moral high ground, and then you're unassailable, right? I'm just for the little guy. I'm just for the blah, 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 and, I can't, assail him. I mean, he's a good guy. He's a smart guy.
Yeah.
I'm helpless at this point. You cede the moral high ground to someone who is immoral. You've lost the fight.
Yeah. That's why Ayn Rand made a big point about to take the moral high ground based on individualism. That we need to convince everyone that individual is the moral high ground. Individual freedom is the moral high ground, because as long as they can come back and say, the common man and the suffering people, they will always win. They will always win the moral argument, because the moral argument always ends with the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the needs of the one. And we need to. You have to be able. You will always lose that argument every time, until we can say that being an individual and standing for yourself, that is the moral high ground. Once we can make that the moral high ground, then maybe the individual will have a chance against all of these collectivist systems that we are just bombarded with constantly. But I mean, there's a lot of other people. Not to leave this all on an Ayn Rand point. But there's a lot of other people who said basically the same thing. And I consider Zarathustra said the same thing. That's what Zarathustra said, is that the moral high ground is the individual, right? You know, the struggle for individualism, and that's what
right.
you know.
But I mean, how
the
that
principle of isolate intelligence is.
But we can see right in front of us, and it wouldn't take much to just note how that idea has been demonized already quite thoroughly. This rugged individualism, is just that's passe. That is, we got to get rid of that. That's pretty much evil. I mean, that sounds like toxic masculinity to me.
Yeah.
What do you think? A going all cowboy, blah blah blah. But I mean, and of course we have to concede. I mean, when you're thinking logically that there are, that individualism. That there's got to be a balance, right? That there's to practice individualism, we have to take a page out of Thomas Jefferson's book and say, you've got to be initiated. You've got to have a system, for the honest and intellectually honest kind of notion of education, not indoctrination, but that logic, rational self-interest, but there's a rational component to that, right? So that you don't just say, otherwise, like you see, like unions, unions are very bad. But look, what was happening in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, people being sent down into mines, just whatever, just basically slaves being really, exploited beyond all, thing. And so, well, that's, they made their free choice, to go down that hole for $1.50 a week. That's to fuck them,
Mm-hmm.
But, it can get pretty extreme, I mean, if you let that individualism run amok, which, I mean, we've seen it in our history, that can be bad. Just like collectivism run amok will definitely be bad also. So that's where the idea of a culture which honors thought, education, insight, and how to be an individual. If you're going to be a sovereign individual, there's in the Middle Ages, whenever they would write these books, the King's Mirror, these ideas of how can I be a sovereign? How can I be a king in my life? There's a kind of mastery there that must be pursued, and that kind of thing being encouraged. But that's completely fallen that's just crazy talk to most people today.
Oh yeah.
I
think that happens. I think that happens naturally. As a human being, I honored my father and my mother, right? And wanted to take care of my mother, like when she was like dying and stuff, and take care of my family and the people that my friends or whatever that I connect with. Getting back to the tribalism thing that you talked about, I think that naturally arises. The urge, the desire to do that is a part of individualism. I didn't have to have a hammer of collectivism banged onto me to know that I needed to. No, I just naturally did that as I am like trying to uplift myself, as a sovereign, trying to strive towards, a sovereign existence that, these are my families, my friends. I'm going to uplift them also, and I'm going to watch out for them. But I get to do it all freely, right?
Right.
When,
that's
when another force comes in and says, "Oh no, you need to help these other people who live on the other side of the world,"
or just people you have no identity with. That is tribalism or whatever. Is like, identity, solidarity, and those kinds of ideas. But so that, for example, you see, like in a family, you have like socialism. Like if you need something and your parents have it, and then they will give it to you, and help you out. But you feel grateful and you're not resentful. But if somebody is, in a political thing wherein somebody like, I'm a homeless person, I'm a bum, whatever it is. Oh, here, the government's going to give you this apartment. Well, what do people do almost immediately? They trash it out, right? Yeah. They don't take care of it. Because they're resentful in the first place. I mean, it's just a psychological thing. They have no identity with, respect for, or interest in these, the givers here, because they're alienated, disassociated from them. They have no connection with them, and so it's not going to be what these what are the homeless in our town? Why don't we just give them homes? It's just not going to work. But if your family does that, then it's a totally different thing psychologically, and that's kind of ultimately what, for example, like with the idea of the appeal, as it originally was, of National Socialism, was this idea that we're all one people, right? We're all family, as it were. We're all, fellow Germans in this case. And so, we'll have socialism within the family. And of course, all of that is just hooey, and it's just another gangster, coming up with a great idea. But in theory, it starts to make sense, as opposed to what they're doing in Russia, right? We're going to take care of our own, our organic people that But that one means we're deciding who is in and who's out, and we're brutal, with those people who are out. It's kind of like La Raza Unida, the Mexican-American group, for the race, everything. For others, nothing. Right, that attitude. Which is not good, not healthy, not, it just goes down. All of these things go down the wrong path, because the true path, the truth, is something which has to do with balance of complex things. And that's where mentality, intellect, spirituality, it comes into play. You cannot escape it. There is no, again, going back to Zurvanism, where there's no mechanism. So this is the formula. Apply it, everything will work. Everything will work fine. It comes down to the individual psyche of individuals to apply these things in a wise manner, and that is hard. Abstinence from things, that's bad, I'm not going to do that. This is always good, I'm always going to do this. Rather, having to actually practice a balanced kind of way of discrimination between this is good, this is a situation, and it is a constant exercise in attention, which is the hardest thing in the world.
So are you familiar with the idea of tabula rasa?
A tabula rasa? Blank slate. Mm-hmm.
Blank slate. Right. The idea that a human is born with a blank slate. It's an idea that I think John Locke talked about it, but it's become very popular. And I mean, this is the idea, certainly in progressivism. What do you think about that?
Oh, that can't be. I mean, that's very. Talking about mechanistic. That is that everyone is the same, and they are a result of their experiences. If they're treated badly, it's not. I'm not a criminal. I'm not bad. Society made me this way, right? And, of course, that was like what their way of thinking was, yeah, and I believe that's true. That's what they would have said. And it says, so therefore we have to, make society healthy and right and, give people only positive and good input, and then we'll have a transformed society. But how many times, say, well, this kid, perfect parent, or two brothers, and one is raised by the same parents, etc. One of them's out robbing banks at 12, and one of them's, going to Harvard, whatever. I mean, it's that there's something else going on there,
Yeah.
But, those people, those tabula rasa type people, which are, very modernistic thinking, like I was a King James or something, had like a child, a newborn child, and put them in a solitary world and didn't allow them to speak, or, no one spoke to them. They kept them in there for years. Or this one kid. And then he said, then we they were doing experiments to see what the original pure language was. And so, then the kid, they go to him when he's like however old. And, of course, he's just a babbling, raving idiot, he's just complete insane. And he says, oh, the child, he says he spoke perfect Hebrew. But they were like doing experiments on people. Well, on the belief that, tabula rasa, if you're just a blank slate, then whatever, if you don't put any input in, then you can see what the slate, has to say purely, just like from nature or something like that. I mean, crazy idea, but, of course you're a human being, as I always say, in my humanities classes, is a cultural animal, that we need input. We are nothing as a species. We are helpless mentally, physically, all the things. Nothing. We can't do anything as well as any animal except think. And to think, we have to be educated. And it's more complicated the society in which you live, the more education, training, input you need from, more knowledgeable people.
Mm-hmm.
And, if it was like a bunch of farmers, if it is how you farm, kid, by the time you're 12, you could be a farmer. But if you're living in our world, there's a lot of stuff you got to learn about how to thrive in a society.
There's a lot you have to learn, but people come into the world already, I think, with certain inclinations and stuff like that. Like even like child psychology, tabula rasa has been like the progressive stance. It justifies public school as long as people come into the world with a blank slate. The powers that be have a reason why we need to take care of everything. Because, if you don't educate people, immediately they're going to end up being radically, they're going to end up being criminals and whatnot. But, to me, this is part of, and it goes back to the Zoroastrian thing, too, that you start thinking about the existence before your life, right? That there's because in the Western sense, we just want to talk about, I think Christianity kind of set this up too, right? That you come into the world by this miraculous thing, and then all you really need to worry about is the future from here on out, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to leave this life, and then you're going to go into another life, so you worry about everything from there. But you don't talk about where you came from. And the Zoroastrianism system starts talking about, oh, no, you made a decision already. You made a really good decision, actually, a smart decision before you came here. So you already came in with something. And the latest child psychology stuff is starting to talk about, even babies have. You take two babies, you separate, no, they already have a proclivity for things. They're not just a complete dumbass, and then we just program them with whatever. Mm-hmm. They already come into the world with some some thoughts, some perspectives.
Right, for good, and that's all you have to, again, say, well, here we have this person, and everyone is different, and everybody's got some kind of, like you said, inclinations or talents and all kinds of things. I mean, otherwise, how could you explain Mozart other than the eternal return? But, I mean, he was like born, it's like, oh, my God, he's composing symphonies at 3. I mean, where his father didn't teach him all this stuff, because it would imply that his father knew all the things, and it was only, it's like a computer, it only knows what you put into it, right? So that's kind of what the tabula rasa would imply, whereas the truth is that individual, is whether a genius or a criminal, a terrible person, like the movie, you've ever seen that movie, The Bad Seed?
Yeah.
Yeah, by the little girl, he's just like a murderer, a psychopath, right?
Yeah.
These people don't, I mean, the same input could be given to 2 different people, and one of them, is, Ed Gein or something, and the other one is just, a little bit unhappy person, but, that's, they're not doing these things. That's, again, it's just, the tabula rasa idea was just a revolutionary or a radical idea that was just an attractive concept for the time, the Enlightenment period, but it doesn't hold water. There's a lot of ideas like that.
Yeah.
That, and there's some truth to the idea that, everyone is within a range. I mean, there's some outliers and anomalies that are just, whether they're Mozarts or psychopaths or whatever. But most people are somewhere in the middle there, And, education and input and positive models of action and thought and everything are all going to make things better, And so, you can do better or, worse as far as that. But like you're saying, the public schools and things like that are just kind of predicated on the idea. That's why, like, when I was wanting to learn to read, when I was just a little kid before I went to school, and but that's kind of weird that if you see that history of the Rune Guild and that picture of taken from the newspaper with that occultation of Venus that I was talking about earlier, in that you can see that I wrote my name, like one of the letters is backwards, but I wrote the name Stevie. That's what they called me, when I was little. And Stevie. And but it's like I wrote my name for some weird reason. I mean, at that moment, in that piece, I wrote that on that, at the bottom of that picture. It was weird. But I was wanting to learn to read, and I remember the moment where my mother asked this first grade teacher, didn't end up being my first grade teacher, but should we try to, teach him to read? And the teacher said, oh, no, don't do that. You've got to, everybody's better if everybody starts off, at the same, thing, at the same time. Of course, it's even better for them, you don't want some smart ass in the class already knows what, letters mean. But that was just like, I remember that. I was probably 5 years old. But it was like, oh, my God, I'm doomed.
Oh, that's so funny.
But that would be typical, right? That's just like we want everybody going along, just like not too fast, not too slow, just everybody kind of go along there. But,
that's interesting. So when I was in public school, like in the 70s, like my parents, like my father, he was like teaching me to read, like before I went to school.
Uh-huh.
So I knew how to spell some words before I went into school. And then when I got into first grade, I was like so good at it that they made me like a class helper. Like the teacher made me, you handle some of the other kids' questions, Isn't that funny? And then, but by the time I got into junior high, it was like I was like basically I was singled out as like a punk, right, by the other students because I was too smart, right?
So
I was like, all of a sudden I'm in trouble for that, right? And it's like basically this is where you realize that public school is basically like prison, you know? It's like, there's like punks and wolves and stuff like that, right? So I left off, like, I realized, oh, it's bad to, like, please the teachers. You got to displease the teachers, right, to survive in this context kind of thing. And at that time, it's like they'd dropped out. Like when I first started, like, going to school, they had, like, a gifted program and stuff like that. And so I was, like, advanced into that. But then it disappeared for a while as I changed schools, and there wasn't a gifted program anymore. And then by the end of high school, they had a gifted program again, and they're getting a hold of me. But I never responded to them because I didn't want to get involved with that and singled out as being a punk, right? I didn't want to get attacked again while I was here.
Right.
So really, this is all just a demonstration of how inept, how impossible it is to create a government-run institution like that suits the needs of everyone, you know, and educates everyone in an equal kind of way. Like even their standards of like what education means like changes every few years. How could it possibly be accurate, you know?
Right. And they, it instituted the cult of stupidity. I didn't see that too much, but I mean, I understood that later on, you know, it became very pronounced, you know, whereas people would hide their, they wouldn't be ashamed of S, but they would hide their A's, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep. You hide your A's.
Oh, look, I'm in there. Oh, very, very, very proud of that. I don't care. Well, that's a cool guy right there, you know. He's worthy of emulation.
Yeah.
But it is like a cult, you know, what I call a cult of stupidity. So,
yeah.
But any culture that spawns that is like, oh man, you're in trouble. It's like out here, you know, in Texas, you know, in rural areas especially, but you know, that like fathers will like, I want their son to play football, but you know, if they were in the chess club or whatever, you know, the father would be ashamed, could never tell anybody at the garage, you know, that's what his kid's doing, you know. But it's like, no, but if the things that are good that will actually benefit the person in the future are shameful, but, you know, getting his knee blown out in a football field, you know, that's great. You know,
yeah.
False hope and bodily injury, that's the way to go.
Yeah.
So, but that's like misspent. That's some kind of atavism, you know, from old like warrior societies, right?
Yeah.
So that you know, that's just kind of from that. But we don't need that anymore.
Yeah.
Excellent. Smart. Yep. Okay. Well, that's been we started off and then we went on and on. It just you can't stop with all these interesting ideas. That's for sure.
I know, it's brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Flowers, for coming on the show again. That's such a great conversation, and you know, keep fighting the good fight and writing these awesome books and helping make the world a better place.
Well, I'll try. I know I probably won't get any. I just hope to leave something behind that can make an even better difference later on. Maybe the world will get better later. Yeah. We can always hope.
Always hope.
Yeah.
Hope burns eternal.
Yeah, it does. Okay, well, that's. I thank you for your stimulating questions and opportunities to express myself here.
Excellent. That's it for that part.
Okay. The important words.
All right. We'll talk to you again.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.